People who like to explore abandoned buildings, what was your biggest "I'm out of here" moment while exploring? The Woodman's Circle home in Sherman, Texas. It's an old abandoned orphanage from the 1940s, where widows and orphans from the war would go to live. I think it was abandoned back in the 70s. My apartment was down the street, so I got curious and went exploring one day. I got stoned on the top floor. I wasn't brave enough to climb the stairs to the roof. They were iron, way too rusty and worn out, and didn't look like they'd support my weight. I went to check out the basement, and it was pitch black. I could hear dripping water and all that. Then, all of a sudden, I heard a loud splash, like someone had jumped into the water. I noped out of there immediately. I went back a few times to take photos, but I never ventured into the basement again. I'm not afraid of the dark, I'm afraid of what's in the dark. When I was a kid, my family bought a house with a really old barn on the property. I loved playing in my grandpa's barn, climbing and jumping on the hay bales, so naturally, I wanted to do the same in this barn. The first time I went in, I got a really creepy feeling, like someone was watching me. I remember being really scared, but I couldn't explain why. I avoided going in or even near it. The original house had been torn down, and we lived in a newer house, so the barn wasn't very close to us. My brother also didn't like going in and had a similar feeling. One time, on a dare, my brother challenged me to go in, and I agreed, as long as I could bring our 2 dogs with me. I went in and started to look around. Again, I had that feeling that someone was watching me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My husky, who was by my side, started growling. I sprinted out of there and never went back in. One day, our neighbors, an older couple from whom we had bought the house, were over, visiting with my mom. I was eavesdropping and overheard them talking about the property's history. It turns out their uncle, who used to own the land, had a stroke and passed away in the barn. This wasn't a time I left, but a few months back, my friends and I went to this abandoned house near where I live to get high. We went out to the garden in the back, and after a while, looking back, we were pretty high, we heard a group of guys approach the house. At first, we thought they just walked past because they went quiet, so we carried on laughing and talking about random stuff. Then, suddenly, the guys came back. Instead of thinking, "Oh crap, maybe we shouldn't be here and these guys could be responsible adults who could get us in trouble for breaking into the house," we decided to shout "hello" to them. They couldn't see us, only hear us, so they started freaking out and ran off. My friends and I couldn't stop laughing, until the guys came back and started smashing up the house, trying to kill whatever ghosts they thought we were. They still hadn't seen us because we were lying out in the overgrown garden. I yelled out to one of them, who I could see in the kitchen, and he finally spotted me and realized it was just a house with no ghosts in it. Weirdly, it turned out to be a guy I knew from primary school years ago. Kind of funny seeing him scared out of his mind, especially since I remembered him as this overconfident, full of himself type. This happened my senior year of high school. I lived in a nice part of Georgia. My family is middle class, but there's a neighborhood called Atlanta Country Club where very wealthy people live. Usher and supposedly Justin Bieber lived there at one point. My high school friends and I decided we wanted to go check out some of the mansions because some were absolutely insane. While we were driving, we noticed one mansion was under construction. My friends thought it would be cool to go explore and see what the house was going to look like. We parked in a cul-de-sac a couple of minutes away so we wouldn't look suspicious. We arrived at the house and walked down this steep driveway. It was basically a hill. We had to climb up to the door because the walkway wasn't built yet. Once we got in, we were in awe of the place. It was at least 4 times the size of my middle-class home. We walked around, checking out the main floor, and then my friends decided to go upstairs. I decided to go down to the basement on my own. As I was heading to the basement stairs, I saw a light turn on down there. At first, I thought it was a motion sensor light and decided to wait just to be safe. I waited for a minute and could hear movement downstairs. I thought maybe it was an animal that had gotten in, so I started going down the stairs. Once I got halfway down, I heard a man scream and glass shatter. I bolted back up the stairs and could hear the man running after me. Luckily, my friends had come back to the main floor, and we all ran out of the house. We jumped from the door and sprinted up the driveway. I took a quick glance back and saw 3 flashlights moving through the house. I also saw a man standing in the doorway with a machete, and he screamed that he was going to end us. We sprinted to my car and drove off. We couldn't call the police because technically, we were breaking and entering. I'll never forget that night, and it's crazy to think my friends and I could have been seriously hurt. This was in Southeast Florida, around 1987 or so. While exploring one of the rare undeveloped areas near my apartment, I found a strange forest of small trees with thickly intertwined branches but bare trunks up to about 1.2 meters high. It reminded me of woods near my house up north, where a local man kept goats. They strip trees as high as they can reach. I noticed a clearing ahead and discovered a perfectly round, grassy area. There were logs set up like benches or pews, all facing an old refrigerator turned on its side. The top was covered in brown stains running down the front. If you're thinking, altar, well, that's exactly what I thought. But that wasn't my, I'm out, moment. Just an unsettling prelude. Soon afterward, I wandered into a more open area close by, tall grass surrounded by a traditional forest. There were 4 or 5 abandoned houses there, in conditions ranging from ruined to mostly intact. It seemed like they'd been moved there and dumped. I entered the most intact one, carefully waiting for my eyes to adjust before venturing too far. South Florida has some pretty unfriendly critters, so it pays to be cautious. There were no furnishings and none of the garbage you'd expect to find in an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. It was clean, dry, and looked almost habitable. I explored the kitchen, no appliances, and a front family/living room. Then I realized there were no spider webs, rat droppings, or any other sign of living creatures. I told myself the house must have been put there very recently. The stairs looked solid, so I went up. At the top, just down the hall, was a ceiling hatch. No hinges, just a board in a frame. I poked it with my walking stick, and it moved a little. All right then. I pushed harder, and it lifted, twisted, and fell to the floor. It was the only noise I'd heard for a while, and now the silence seemed heavier somehow. Here's the moment. Up in the darkness above me, I heard a scratching that started and stopped abruptly, then a thump, then a dragging sound. I am not a brave man, so I was already backing away when the series of sounds repeated, closer this time. When it happened again, even closer, I decided it was time to be somewhere else. It sounded exactly what went through my mind, like someone dragging themselves toward the opening from out of the dark. Or maybe a zombie. I thought about that, too, and after I had time to chill at home, I worried that I might have abandoned some poor kidnapped victim or something. My roommate's solution was to go back the next day, but it was raining, so we waited. When we finally got back, I didn't go inside. I got major creeps just standing outside, so I can only tell you what he said. Yes, the house was strangely clean. Yes, it was pretty sturdy. Yes, he went up the stairs. But then he called me a liar, because when he reached the hatch and shone his light on it, he saw that it wasn't open with the board lying on the floor. It was shut. A friend and I camped out in an old military building in the middle of nowhere. It was so remote that we thought it was safe to camp in one of the more deserted parts of the complex. We put an old skateboard against the door to warn us if anyone came in. We tried staying awake in shifts, but we both ended up falling asleep. Anyway, we woke up, and the skateboard was propped up on its side right next to our tent with "Get Up" written on the deck. Some random stranger had literally been standing just half a meter from where we were sound asleep. We both got out of there as fast as we could once we woke up. Not really an exploration story, but my dad is a residential painter. Once, he was painting a house on an acreage, hundreds of feet from the nearest neighbor, that had been damaged by a large fire, so it had been stripped down quite a bit. My dad was spraying "Smoke Stop" on the rafters upstairs when he heard voices coming from the basement. He assumed it was the plumbers working down there. He went down, but there was nobody in the house at all. He checked the driveway, his was the only vehicle there. He went back to work and heard talking again. Now he was getting weirded out. He went downstairs, no talking. Back upstairs, and on the third time, he packed up his things and took off. It wasn't an abandoned place, just an empty, unused house. It used to belong to my friend's grandparents, who had passed away, if I remember correctly. We were teenagers, and hookah, water pipe, was very popular back then, so we decided to go smoke my brand new hookah and have some drinks there to keep it hidden from our parents. The house had 2 stories, and the top floor was packed with boxes. You could go up the stairs, but it was hard to get into the rooms because of all the stuff. We were just chilling, sitting cross-legged on the carpeted floor of the living room on the first floor when, suddenly, the kitchen door, one of those push-to-open doors with no knob or lock, flew open as if someone had punched it open to enter the room. Right after that, we heard someone running up the stairs really fast. The stairs were beside the kitchen door, right in front of us. We couldn't see anyone, but we clearly heard footsteps that went up, ran through the hall packed with boxes, and then stopped suddenly. We stared at each other for a second before bolting out of the house so fast that we flipped over the hookah with the lit-up coal. Panicked, I grabbed the hookah and the coal with my hands to get it out of the house and got a pretty bad burn. We never went back to that place again. About a 5-minute walk from where I live, there's this small, 5-room bungalow that's been abandoned since we moved here back in 2004. Naturally, my friends and I decided that after school we should go in, explore, and see if we could find anything cool. Nothing really stood out at first, just some old food tins from the 80s, some clothes, etc. But there was one room that really stood out. It was a little girl's room, with old children's books, a creepy rocking horse, and weird stick figures drawn all over the walls. After feeling a bit freaked out, my friends and I decided it was time to leave. After opening the front door and jumping the fence, we were greeted by the neighbors of this abandoned house. But they didn't seem friendly or welcoming. They didn't actually say anything to us. The husband and wife just stood there about 6 meters away, with no expression on their faces, looking like something out of The Hills Have Eyes. I couldn't explain exactly what was off about them, but something didn't seem human. Needless to say, we bolted and never went back. I remember exploring this abandoned power station and huge goods yard. The place is dead old, built in 1919, with the goods yard dating back to around 1850. It's ancient. I remember spotting this hole near the rubble of the cooling tower and getting really excited when I realized it was the water reservoir for the towers. It was flooded, but I had waders with me. The thing seemed to stretch on forever, but the way it was designed creeped me out massively. There were thick, square supports in the middle of the huge tunnel, and the walls were angled, with additional supports on them, so there were plenty of places for something to hide behind those concrete blocks. The place stank, and after a while, I started feeling dizzy. In hindsight, I'd bet there were nasty gases like methane and asbestos dust in there, probably the cause. I began seeing little movements behind the supports, just out of the corner of my flashlight. Then my flashlight started flickering, and I don't know if it was the gas or just my own nerves, but I swear I saw 2 small lights staring back at me, in the shape of 2 eyes. I got out of there quick. I know it was probably just the gas, or maybe the light shining off a piece of metal in the tunnel, but no way am I going back down there. I used to explore a lot of old factories in the former GDR, and I have plenty of stories. There are more dangers than just getting caught or hurting yourself. Back then, a lot of chemicals were used to keep buildings warm in winter or make them fire resistant. One material is asbestos, which you'd find everywhere. The moment you see broken asbestos, you need to get out as fast as you can. Breathing in small particles can lead to a high risk of cancer over time. Just a quick disclaimer for anyone thinking of exploring abandoned buildings. My favorite story happened at a Soviet military site that was also used during the Second World War, with the charming name Adolf Hitler Lager. It's now called Forst Zinna, if anyone wants to look it up. Forst Zinna is like a large abandoned city in the forest near my hometown. In one building, we went to the upper floor and found a room set up like a child's room, with a big children's bed in the middle. It didn't look super old but not new either. It had a rotting mattress and dirty blankets on it. And let's not forget the human feces in the corner and the smell. We kind of just stood there, not saying anything, when suddenly we heard the sound of a door slamming shut aggressively in the distance. At that moment, it felt like a horror movie come to life. We started running away from the sound, and luckily, there were 2 doors in that room, so we managed to escape. Once we were outside, we climbed over the wall, grabbed our bikes, and took off as fast as we could. I still think about that incident a lot, especially since the main road to Berlin runs right by Forst Zinna. There are tons of rumors and ghost stories about the place because of how many people were executed there. Some even say that if you drive by Forst Zinna at night, you can sometimes see a light in the old general's building. Looking back, it was probably just a guard keeping intruders away, but the whole scene was incredibly eerie. This was 2 years ago, and it still haunts me a little. If you're curious, Just search Forst Zinna on Google and check out some pictures, it might give you a better sense of the place. This happened about 4 years ago, not a building, but a graveyard in an old abandoned coal town called Red Ash. This place is notoriously haunted, with multiple stories of apparitions and paranormal activity in the area. There are all kinds of legends, a graveyard of child coal miners, a woman who cries over her grave every night, the spirits of miners walking along the train tracks, a witch's shack, among other things. Pretty much anyone in my area knows these stories, and most people avoid the area because of them, or because it's down a back road with one-lane bridges and potholes. But, being dumb teens, my friends and I thought it'd be fun to check it out. So one night, I was driving around with a couple of friends when we started talking about Red Ash. Friend A and I had never been there, so friend B insisted we go right then. The place is about a 30-minute drive from where we live, so friend A and I agreed, and we headed out in a tiny, two-door Mini Cooper, determined to find all the legendary spots, starting with the graveyard. We never got past the graveyard. We all got out of the car once we found the graveyard and started looking around for any signs of the paranormal, all of us jumpy as hell since it was 2 a.m., we kept hearing footsteps in the woods, and the only light we had was from our phone flashlights. We tried to take our time, and I eventually split off from the others to look around on my own. Friend A and B stayed on one side, while I went to the other. The graveyard is pretty small, so we were only about 6 meters apart as we roamed around. It was mostly just us saying stuff like, "Found anything yet? Just this baby snake. Ew, no, keep that over there." Then I noticed a set of 2 twin headstones, very old, the writing weathered but still visible. They caught my attention because they were twin stones, probably a couple. They were about 30 centimeters wide and nearly a meter tall, standing on one base, so the whole thing was close to 1.2 meters in height. Most of the other stones were small or in-ground markers, mostly for children or poorer individuals. I circled the headstones, starting at the front. When I came back around and began to walk away, the left stone literally broke in half and fell toward me. It hit the ground with a loud thump, which is what made me turn around. It was a horizontal break, but the stones had no cracks, and I hadn't touched them at all. I jumped, turned, and screamed at the same time. Both friend A and friend B screamed. Friend A whipped around to see what happened while friend B just took off running toward the car. I started running too, grabbing friend A so B didn't drive off without us. Friend B dove headfirst into the back seat from the passenger side, friend A jumped into the driver's side, and I threw the front seat back and hopped in while B's legs were still hanging out the door, stuck between the seat and the door frame. We drove off with the passenger door still open, and I held it closed as best I could with B's legs hanging out. Once we were moving, I pulled my seat up so B could finally climb in. I'm actually cracking up now, remembering this. We were all completely shook. We decided that was enough for the night and called it quits. We've gone back a few times since then, and it's always spooky, but we've never had an encounter quite like that first visit. I'm actually planning to buy some cheap ghost hunting equipment and get those friends to go back with me, because this place is a goldmine for ghostly encounters. This tale takes place in Detroit, Michigan, USA, around 2002. The building is the Detroit Shipping Terminal building, south of the bridge. It had a huge Boblo Island mural painted on the side and a water tower on top. The awesome part. This building was absolutely amazing. It was gigantic. The ceiling on the first floor was 3 stories tall and even had railroad tracks running through it. We got up to the 5th floor, which had cement floors and ceilings. The pillars looked like the mines of Moria from The Lord of the Rings. My buddy and I whispered, "My God, could you imagine playing Unreal Tournament in this place?" As we walked along, we came to another chamber. There was a thin crack in the ceiling, and hanging from the edge were thin, 2-foot-long stalactites. They were red, cyan, and green, following the jagged crack for about 30 meters. My buddy and I were in awe. I took pictures and digitized them. The freaky part. On that same floor, we saw a place that looked like a human trafficking pen. The sad part. In the 10th floor stairwell, we found the perfect skeleton of a dog that had passed away. No animal deserves to pass alone and trapped like that. That's Detroit, a diamond in the rough. I have 1,000 stories like this. 2 Halloweens ago, my older siblings and I decided to hop the gate into the abandoned school across from our house. It hadn't been touched since well before we moved in, 14 years prior, and was condemned due to asbestos, so we wore masks. As soon as we entered, something felt off. First weird thing, a light in the hall flickered, even though the building wasn't receiving any power. We figured it must be a battery-powered light or something and brushed it off. Second weird thing, when we got to the hallway with the PE lockers, the only lockers in the school, since we don't normally have lockers in England, a few of them were dented inward, forming a circle. There was also some kind of substance on the floor. I still have no clue what it was, but it definitely didn't look like blood. Third and last weird thing, we entered the PE hall, and my brother got a ball thrown at him. The thing was, to our knowledge, we were the only ones who had gone into this place, given the danger of being there. Yes, we were stupid, and yes, we should have known better. Before the ball could even drop to the ground, we bolted out of there and went home. Later that year, when the council was demolishing the school, they found bones in the storage area of the PE hall. All I learned was that the bones had been there a while, and I don't know what happened with the case after that. As a superstitious person, I can't help but wonder if they, or their killer, were the ones who threw that ball at us. So yeah, that was my and my siblings' "we're out of here" moment. Here in Moscow, we have a famous abandoned building called Havrino Hospital that was never finished. In the early 2010s, it was this creepy place with tons of creepypasta-like stories, ranging from ghosts to cults performing rituals there. This is my story with that place. I was 13, along with 2 friends my age and one guy who was 15. As young, reckless kids in Russia, we loved doing stupid and really dangerous things, so we finally decided to visit Havrino Hospital, which wasn't far from where we lived, just a 30-minute bus ride. We met at 2 p.m. as usual and set out on our adventure. The hardest part, honestly, was getting over the fence and avoiding the guards, but our grown-up friend had done some research and found a hole under the fence. If I remember right, we entered the southeast wing through a window and started exploring. The first hour was pretty uneventful, aside from some cool and creepy graffiti and a moment when our grown-up friend jumped from one side of an elevator shaft to the other. But as we went deeper into the hospital, that's when things got unsettling. There was barely any light coming in from the windows, making it hard to see, and one of our friends, a bit of a prankster, was trying to scare us. Then, we all stopped and got quiet, listening to the eerie emptiness of the building. And that's when we heard a terrible, loud scream echoing through the walls and corridors. To this day, we have no idea what it was, but we weren't brave, or dumb, enough to try investigating in the dark. We just ran as fast as we could, terrified out of our minds. Since that day, I haven't been too enthusiastic about exploring abandoned buildings, especially hospitals. About 10 years ago, I was visiting a friend in Germany near Dresden. She took me to an old abandoned Nazi summer palace, and we climbed through the fence to explore. It was a really cool, massive place, especially the old ballroom and stage area. Anyway, we're deep in the building, which was already creepy given its history, when we start hearing what sounds like gunfire. We quickly realize it's coming from somewhere inside the building and moving around. We start freaking out, trying to get the hell out of there. Then we see someone dressed all in black with a gun run past the end of one of the hallways, which scared the absolute life out of me. We round another corner and nearly run straight into another person in black, also holding a gun. Thankfully, it turns out they were just teenage boys playing some kind of laser tag or paintball game. Terrifying at the time, though. A friend and I took a shortcut while walking at night and stumbled upon a really cool park. It had a playground, monkey bars, seesaws, and other odd contraptions, plus large walls running parallel on either side with a flimsy metal fence at the far end that led to a canal, kind of like a cul-de-sac or a funnel. It was dimly lit but had a nice vibe, so we stayed and goofed around for a while. We ended up coming back on weekends after that, always at night for some reason. There was an abandoned apartment complex on one end and a row of really old houses that might as well have been abandoned, which made the park feel isolated. But we liked it, so we kept coming back. One night, we were both chilling quietly. I was lying on a bench, and he was on the grass, when we heard a noise. It was maybe 2 or 3 a.m., and we knew people didn't live in the complex, and it was too late for the few people who lived in the houses to be out, so we grew alert. We heard mumbling, but the park was too dim to see anyone. We stayed quiet, and we heard it again, this time on the other side of the park. There was grass, but we didn't hear any footsteps. We both started freaking out a bit, but after a few rounds of mumbling, it just stopped. We waited a couple of minutes, then bolted. Curious, the next day, we went back in the morning to check it out. When we got there, we realized we'd never seen the place in daylight, and I could have sworn there seemed to be more trees at night. One of the walls had a few cinder blocks missing, so we peeked through and realized it was next to a cemetery. My friend got a bit spooked, thinking about what had happened the night before, and started walking around until he stepped on a large piece of flesh on the ground. We checked it out, and it looked like a large femur bone. We both got spooked and started to walk away, wondering if it could have been human or animal, when we noticed more flesh scattered on the grass. As we widened our search, we found more remains. They were from a pig, all around the park, right where we had been hearing the noises. We never came back. In downtown Columbia, South Carolina, there used to be a condemned asylum. It burned down recently, but I was lucky enough to explore it a couple of years ago before the fire. It hadn't been in use since the 1980s and had only grown creepier over time. The main building and its supporting wings were 5 stories, forming a complex with long, narrow, and sometimes dirt-floored basements linking all the buildings. The dilapidation and decay inside the building created gaping holes in the floors that sometimes dropped several stories down into darkness. Doors had fallen from their hinges, graffiti covered the walls, glass was strewn over the floors, and half-full filing cabinets were scattered throughout. With that setting, some friends and I were exploring the 4th floor of the main building, not far from the central bell tower. It was probably after 1 a.m., and all we had were our phone flashlights, barely illuminating anything beyond a few meters. We came into an open room, and in the dim light, something glinted in the middle of the room. We moved closer to see what it was. It was an old patient's chair, complete with leather wrist straps. Under it was a pentagram painted on the floor in red. About a meter in front of it lay the petrified carcass of a cat. The room was covered in graffiti, referencing the devil, dying, and screaming. It was an incredibly freaky find. Everyone in the group, except for me and another guy, pretty much bailed at that point. I pushed through my fear long enough to sit in the chair for a picture, and then we started making our way out. Not long after leaving the room, we heard a thumping noise from the floor above us. Already spooked, we quickly got out of there in a half-run, careful not to fall through the massive holes in the floors. I never went back to that room again, despite going back to the asylum a few more times. That room remains the scariest thing I ever experienced. I once came across a meth head casually packing a bowl while I was out wandering around, catching rattlesnakes for venom. I was fully loaded with graffiti gear, heading into the site, and decided to offer the meth monster with a bag of live snakes a joint as a peace offering. Surprisingly, he was actually quite pleasant, but I have plenty of experience with meth users and didn't feel too comfortable around one with a bag full of snakes while I was painting with my back exposed. So, I just did a quick sketch of Snake Man on my way out. This was an old mill with tons of walls and cool stuff to paint, so it was a spot I frequented. Next time I went back, during the day to avoid him, he came skipping up to me about 2 minutes down the trail. "Hey, dude, did you do that painting of me catching snakes?" I said, "Yeah. Man, you do your thing. I got your back around here. I'll give a holler if kids or cops come." So I said, "And, you know, the messed up junkies too." He looked me dead in the eye and replied, "Hell yeah, man. There's some seriously messed up meth heads who come around here. They camp right over there in the summer." I did my painting that day, but I never went back. I really don't want to meet the kind of people he considers messed up. This wasn't an abandoned building story, but it did happen while I was exploring a sketchy area. Near my house, there was a local beach known for 2 things. It was a hangout for high school kids, and it was also where some sketchy people went to sell drugs or do who knows what else. It was secluded and in a nice area, but it was the only place in town where you could swim in the river. My parents rarely let me go there, even though it was just a 1-minute bike ride away. But when I got into high school, I started doing what I wanted and didn't care about their rules anymore. So one day during sophomore year, I went down there alone and biked around. I'd seen some sketchy stuff there before, like used condoms, but this time when I got to the beach area, I found something that still bothers me to this day. It was a cut-off ponytail. It wasn't loose hair that had just fallen out, it was clearly cut off by scissors or a knife. Now, it's possible that someone got a makeshift haircut on the beach, and that's probably the most likely explanation. But I still wonder whose ponytail it was. Such a strange thing to find. Needless to say, I biked out of there right away. One day, I made the dumb decision to go into a building without adequate PPE, personal protective equipment. I saw a huge buildup of mouse droppings and even a mouse staggering around. I got the hell out of there and spent a fun few days obsessively hoping I didn't catch hantavirus or the plague, both of which are present in my area, not to mention all the other environmental hazards. The number of people who routinely explore abandoned buildings without PPE is astounding. If any of my photography students ever try that in class, they'll fail the assignment, which is honestly the least bad thing that could happen to them. I still think about the idiots who looted an abandoned building I know about. It has a ton of lead, cadmium, and who knows what else leaching from the basement. Used to be a print shop. I've never stepped inside because I know what's in there, but somewhere, there are total idiots with antique tchotchkes they stole and lungs full of substances that make Flint look like the Sierra Club. They probably won't even know what hit them for at least 10 years. The worst hazards in urban exploration aren't obvious, and they might not show adverse effects for decades. I don't want to sacrifice my 70s to cancer just because I wanted a cool photo in my 20s. That so many people willingly skip a cheap respirator just boggles my mind. Exploring the old SEPTA railway factory in North Philadelphia with a couple of friends. The place was absolutely huge and beautiful. We were being dumb, hopped up on weed and Adderall, and as we were about to walk through a door leading into a bigger part of the building, I looked through a hole in the wall and was convinced I saw a man lying on his stomach with a pistol aimed at the door. We sat there frozen for about 20 minutes, only to realize I was somehow hallucinating the whole thing. I was actually looking at a pair of old boots and some clothes behind a knocked-over table. I don't know, I've never hallucinated like that before. Really weird. Anyway, after we finally went through the door, we found ourselves in a hallway that went forward and then left, forming a square perimeter around the outside of the building. The inside of the building was completely hollow, so you could see all the way across to the other side. That's when we saw a group of 7 or 8 people emerge from the shadows, possibly homeless, and they immediately started yelling and chasing us around the perimeter of the building. Luckily, we made it out. Never going back there again. Not exactly an abandoned building story, but I hope you'll enjoy it just the same. In 1964, the Air Force assigned my dad, a captain with the Strategic Air Command (SAC), to service at Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City, Louisiana. After settling in over the summer, I became friends with some kids around my age. I was 11, who would be in my 5th grade class when school started. Some of them were Air Force brats, like me, and others had lived near the base all their lives, so we were all pretty familiar with airfields, military activity, and so on. One day, while hanging out near a remote fence line, we noticed a strange opening. It wasn't exactly a gate since it didn't have any movable parts, but it had partitions on both sides so you couldn't run straight through. My friends dared me to sneak onto the base and check out the nearest hangar. Eager to prove myself, I took the dare. After slipping through the opening, I ran across the tarmac to the closest open hangar. Inside, I saw the craziest looking jet with enormous wings that nearly touched both sides of the hangar. The wings were held up by small wheels, not the usual landing gear. Everything about this jet looked unfamiliar. Between my dad's career, airshows, model building, and the like, I thought I knew about most of the current aircraft, but this jet was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Right away, I realized I'd messed up big time and was probably looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. After I got back to my friends and described what I saw, they were impressed that I'd been brave enough to take on the dare. That night at dinner, I casually asked my dad what kind of plane I'd seen in the hangar. Looking back, I was so naive to ask him what I'd seen while trespassing on a military base. My dad blew up, really blew up. He stood up and started yelling at me. My mom grabbed my brother and left the room, leaving me to my fate. I'd never seen him so angry, and I melted into a blubbering mess. That seemed to calm him down a bit, and my mom and brother eventually came back to the table. Without answering my questions about the plane, he explained to the family that if word of what I'd done got out, it could cost him his assignment. Realizing that I could have put my dad's career in jeopardy shocked me. He then explained his anger was also because of how close I'd come to getting seriously hurt. I didn't understand at first, so he asked if I'd ever seen the guard dogs, German shepherds, on base. I said yes. He told me that the fence opening I'd gone through was where the guards and dogs transitioned their security sweeps from inside the fence to the outer perimeter. If the dogs had seen me, the guards would have released them to subdue me until they arrived. To drive the point home, he later took me to a demonstration of the guard dogs to show me how well trained and lethal they could be. He never directly answered my questions about the jet, but years later, as more information about the U-2 spy plane became public, he told me, "That's what you saw in the hangar." Although it was 4 years after U-2 pilot Gary Powers was famously shot down, there still wasn't much known about the U-2 at the time. Only after he retired from the Air Force did he share that, besides his regular duties involving air refueling fighters and bombers, including a tour in Vietnam, he'd also done refueling missions for U-2 spy planes, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was this strip of road near where I lived, with old bunkers spaced out along it. One afternoon, I decided to ride my bike down the road just to explore since I'd never been that way before. It was quiet, no cars passing by, and I had my headphones in, just enjoying the ride. Nothing about it felt spooky or unsettling. Then I came across this one bunker with its door open, completely covered in graffiti. I stopped my bike right across from it to take a break and drink some water. As I stood there, I got curious. I put down my kickstand, got off my bike, and started walking toward the bunker. I was sort of tensing up as I got closer, even though it was broad daylight. The doorway was so dark that almost no sunlight got through. As I approached, I suddenly heard a very whispery, "Go back." Well, I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted back to my bike, skipping the whole kickstand up process, and pedaled faster than I've ever pedaled before. A few days later, while riding the bus home with my headphones in, I heard the same whispery, "Go back," in my ear. My heart dropped for a second, but then I realized, it was just Snowblind by Black Sabbath playing. Apparently, I hadn't actually heard anything from the bunker, it was the song all along, perfectly timed to scare the crap out of me. Needless to say, I was not amused with myself. I'm late to the party, but I have a good one. Back in college, on the walk home from our favorite bar, there was an abandoned church. It looked like a normal single-story building from the street, but since it was built on the side of a huge hill, it was actually more like a 5-story structure. There was even an attached house where nuns used to live. It became a bit of a weekend ritual for us. We'd close down the bar, and on our drunken walk home, we'd break into the church to explore. The Cincinnati Zoo had purchased the property years earlier with plans to tear it down and build a parking lot. During some of our explorations, we'd find random stuff the zoo was storing there, Christmas decorations, animal costumes, and once, a huge box of glow necklaces they must have sold during their Festival of Lights. Fast forward a few weekends. A few of us were drunk and decided to explore further than ever before. It was 3 a.m., and we were deep in the building, 5 floors down into a maze-like area. That's when we walked into a room and saw a single glow necklace lying there, shining green and bright as if someone had just cracked it open. We realized we weren't alone, but we didn't see or hear anyone. That was enough for us. We said, "Fuck this," bolted out of there, and went straight to Skyline Chili. We used to explore this underground cave beneath the city that resembled a sewer but was much tighter, only about 1.5 meters high and just wide enough for 2 people side by side. It had water flowing up to our ankles, and it seemed to go on forever. Every day, we'd go back to try and reach the end, adapting as we went by switching from candles to flashlights since the candles would die when we went too deep. Moment 1, we found a branching path and spotted someone's flashlight and an ID card lying there. Instinctively, we thought they'd been killed or something had happened to them, leaving their belongings abandoned. Moment 2, farther along, we saw a draping web or slimy structure hanging from the ceiling. At first, we thought it was a human, but thankfully, it wasn't when we took a closer look. Moment 3, we finally reached what looked like the end of the cave, where it narrowed into a smaller, 1-meter-tall passage, but the end opened up into a chamber bigger than the main cave. The walls were covered in weird ritualistic symbols and writing. We ran out of there, making the 2-hour walk home in less than an hour. Keep in mind, everything was pitch black without our flashlights, so we never knew what we'd find until we pointed the light in just the right direction. It honestly felt like we were living in a horror game. Most of the responses in this thread are either scary or disgusting. I'd like to share one that's simply sad. I once went into a boarded-up, condemned building in Southside Chicago. It was 3 stories tall, kind of like a freestanding townhouse. The building had been abandoned for a long time, the tiny lawn was super overgrown, and the whole lot was surrounded by a chain-link fence covered in warning signs to stay out. Surprisingly, it wasn't a trap house. It smelled like piss and had that dusty, cobwebby, unclean feeling that empty houses do. The walls were covered in graffiti, but there were no needles or anything dangerous. Honestly, it was a pretty fun place to explore. I had no idea why it had been condemned. But then I came to the 3rd room I checked, and it was clearly occupied. The occupant wasn't there, but the signs of someone living there were obvious. There was a lumpy, dirty futon mattress on the ground with some sheets, along with various personal items scattered around, clothes and other belongings. 2 things really hit me. First, there were 2 cups beside the bed. One was a disposable paper fast food cup, like you'd get at a place like KFC for soda, and the other was one of those old, hard, semi-opaque red plastic cups from pizza parlors. One was half full of water, and the other had a toothbrush in it. The fact that this person had separate cups for drinking water and holding their toothbrush was so humanizing, and it broke my heart. Second, there was a teddy bear in the bed. It was a cheap, generic blue knockoff Care Bear, super old and well-loved. It was filthy, just like the rest of the nest on the futon, but it was clearly something this person cared about, a piece of their history. That bear had been with them for a long time, and it felt so personal. I didn't meet the occupant, but I left after entering that room. At that moment, it stopped feeling like an exploration and started feeling like an intrusion. The person who lived there became real to me, not just some faceless rando. This was someone who cared about brushing their teeth, who drank water from a clean cup, and who slept with a stuffed animal despite falling on hard times. It was sobering and sad. A few months ago, my friend and I decided to check out a long-abandoned train depot in rural Virginia, not far from Danville. The place was in the middle of nowhere. We parked in a small gravel pull-off by the tracks, and across from us was a rundown house with a woman sitting on the porch. Other than that, there wasn't much around. We were a couple of miles down super rural backroads, far from the main highway. I parked my little Honda Civic, and as soon as we got out, the woman on the porch yelled something at us. We couldn't hear what she said, so we just gave her a thumbs up and kept going. She got on her cell phone, but we didn't think much of it. After all, the cops were at least 30 minutes away in a place like this. We headed into the building. The depot itself was pretty underwhelming. It was almost totally empty except for a few modern cabinets stacked in one room, still with Home Depot tags on them, but seeing the old structure was kind of cool. Eventually, we found a door that led to a super steep, narrow staircase going upstairs. Upstairs, there was one very large room with a door leading to a smaller room on the opposite end. We went inside and found 2 modern-looking dressers. When we opened the drawers, they were completely filled with KKK robes, flags, and other stuff. That was enough for us. We decided to get out of there quickly. As we were making our way back to the road, pushing through chest-high brush, we saw an old Ford Ranger pulling into the driveway of the house we'd parked near. A bunch of redneck-looking dudes were piled in the truck bed, and they started yelling expletives at us. Keep in mind, I was driving a lowered Honda Civic with a massive spoiler, basically a neon sign saying, "We're not from around here." This was the kind of place where, if a couple of city boys went missing, no one would find us. I got in the car and floored it. The truck followed us most of the way back to Danville, but we eventually lost them in traffic. Definitely not going back there again. My so and I snuck into this building that was said to have been a boys' school and later a mental institution. Across one side of the road, which is open and where most people go, the place is covered in spray paint. You can find windows with bars, metal bed frames, broken pianos, and other eerie things that seem to back up the stories about the place. But across the street, there's a locked fence with a long driveway leading down to 2 buildings at the base of the mountain. The building on the right looks like it's been half burned, with the roof collapsed, kind of like an old church, so we didn't go there. Instead, we headed to the more intact building on the left. The first room we entered was massive, with an open floor plan, shattered glass all over the floor, and huge windows. Since it was midday, the room was super bright, which felt important at the time. We explored a few more rooms that were also well lit and covered with interesting graffiti, and everything seemed fine. Cool, even. Then we came to a hallway that was completely pitch black. The blackest black you could imagine. At the far end of the hallway, we could vaguely see something big hanging and swinging slightly in the darkness, and there was a steady dripping sound echoing through the space. That dripping sound was the worst part. It was like something out of a horror movie. What made it worse was that there was no wind or breeze moving through the building, so we couldn't figure out what was making the object swing. And it was the middle of a bright day. How could that hallway have been so perfectly dark? We stood there for a few minutes, just staring, waiting for one of us to say, "Let's go check it out." But the longer we waited, the scarier it felt. It was like if something was down there, it could come grab us at any moment. That was enough. We both noped out of there and didn't look back. We stumbled upon an arson in progress once, and didn't realize it until the place burned down the next day. My friends and I used to explore a lot of abandoned places years ago, and still do occasionally, and one of our favorite spots was Woodville State Hospital in Pittsburgh. It was massive, and every time we went, there was always something new to discover. One evening, we headed up there and started hearing noises, something breaking, like glass or wood. We figured it was just some other kids being assholes and vandalizing the place. We tried to find whoever was making the noise, but we couldn't spot anyone. Apparently, they noticed us and snuck away before we got too close to the main building. At first, we didn't think too much of it and kept exploring. But when we entered the main building, the one with the giant bell tower and chapel, we were greeted by something unnerving. The entire main room, which was enormous, had been filled with debris. Broken pianos, tables, chairs, pallets, and other random items had all been dragged into the room and scattered into a giant pile. It freaked us out because we recognized some of the items from other parts of the property, and it must have taken a lot of effort, definitely more than one person, to collect everything and pile it up like that. We couldn't understand why anyone would do that, and it gave us a bad feeling. We decided to get out of there fast and ran back to our car. The next day, shortly after sundown, my best friend called me in a panic, yelling for me to turn on the news. I tuned in to see live coverage of Woodville burning to the ground. All of the big buildings were ablaze. It turns out the debris we saw being piled up was used as fuel for the arson. We must have interrupted the arsonists the previous day, causing them to flee, only for them to come back the next night to finish the job. I've never really been the "I'm bored, let's go into that shack over there and see if we find a dead body" type, but when I was little, my cousin definitely was. I remember living in the country, and down the road, there was this really old, gross-looking building, like an old cabin, in the middle of an unused field. My friend and I would sometimes dare each other to run up and touch it, but we never went to the door or inside. I have a deathly fear of bugs crawling in my ears, so I avoided places where bugs might be near my head. One summer, my cousin came to stay with us. She was bored out of her mind. We had to walk 1.5 miles to a McDonald's/gas station to get Wi-Fi, and we had no TV or internet at home. She loved creepypastas and horror stories and would read them to me. When the cabin came up in conversation, her eyes lit up, and I knew I was screwed. So there we were, standing in front of the cabin, with me telling her how horrible an idea it was. She ignored me and ran straight to the door. I didn't want to go inside, but I also didn't want her to get hurt, trapped, or worse. So I followed her, even though I was just a chubby 12-year-old girl and she was 13. The door was nailed shut, but the wood was so rotten she managed to kick it open. She walked straight inside, and I followed with my hands pressed over my ears. Bugs, remember? The first room was a big open space with plants growing everywhere, mold, nails sticking out of the walls, and a single table in the corner. There were spiders everywhere, and I begged her to leave, but she insisted on checking out the next room. The smell was disgusting, so bad I wanted to vomit, but I assumed it was the mold. When we got to the doorway leading to the second room, we both completely freaked out. The entire room was filled, almost to the ceiling, with giant skeletons. At the time, we didn't know what they were, but apparently, they were horse skeletons. We didn't have any experience with horses, so we just knew they were animal bones. Some still had flies buzzing around them, which made it even worse. I'm not a screamer, but I jumped back several feet and bolted out as fast as I could. My cousin wasn't far behind me. We didn't stop running until we were halfway home. My cousin even threw up in the middle of the road from being so scared and running so fast. When we told my mom and aunt, they had no answers but did yell at us for being dumb. To this day, I still don't understand why a cabin was filled with horse skeletons. Some bones had flies on them. Does that mean some were more recent? The whole thing left me with nightmares about some kind of horse serial killer. We spent the rest of the summer cleaning the house and making DIY face masks, and I avoided anything remotely creepy. I've since moved, so I don't even know if the shack is still there, but I'm still baffled by what we saw. 2. Location scouting for a shoot, looking for an old abandoned farmhouse. I was lucky to be with some people on the first incident. We were told of an old farmhouse among a grove of trees, so we went to look. After a bit of poking around, I stepped onto the linoleum in the kitchen, and my foot went straight through, like stepping on a sheet of paper. Half of my body went through, but somehow I caught myself with my arms and my one foot still on firm floor. I called for help and crawled and pulled myself out. Turns out, there was a cistern under the kitchen. All those years of having floorboards covered with linoleum and moist air below had caused the entire wooden slats underneath to rot into basically nothing. I'm somewhat afraid of the dark and closed spaces, and it still gives me a horrifying feeling imagining if I had been alone and had gone right into that cistern. Imagining the state of the water, the bugs, deceased animals, putrid water. I have no idea how deep it was. I sprained my ankle badly but considered myself lucky. The second was another location scout for a shoot, but not in abandoned houses. I was invited to a farmhouse on someone's property, their old house, which was mostly empty. I found the place and walked in alone. It had the feel of a 1950s 4-level split but renovated in a 1980s style. Everything was fine until I got to the top floor. I was completely overtaken with terror for no logical reason. I'm a fairly smart and rational person. I can't explain this, but I felt I was in the presence of something evil, something that would completely crush me if it could. This sense of doom and dread hit me so hard, I ran down the stairs with my camera and out the door, hopped in my car, and drove away fast. I parked at the top of the hill where I could still see the farmhouse. I looked at it and wanted to laugh at myself, to dismiss it as my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't. It felt far too real. I got in my car and drove to the nearest town. I went into a gas station, trying to forget the feeling, wondering if everyone could see it on my face somehow. I grabbed some bad food and went back to my car. I climbed in, sat down, and began to weep. I can't explain this. It was likely my mind or subconscious messing with me, but part of me is still convinced I encountered something awful that day. Not really a "fuck this, I'm out" moment, but I am sort of a protector of a few key places around my neck of the woods. When I first got started, I earned the trust of the property owner by helping him out around the property. One day, we went in and got charged by some sea addict. When she realized there were two of us, she ran off. We called the cops, and they arrested her. Backstory: the home is a well-known squatter hangout. When we went inside, we found uncapped needles with fluid in them, human waste in every room of the house, several bottles of alcohol, and other things. It could have been dangerous if there hadn't been a few of us there. If you're an explorer, please don't trespass. But if you do, always take a buddy and tell a third person where you're going. You never know who or what is hiding in these places, especially in remote areas. I would much rather scold you for trespassing with a friend than read your obituary. I don't like to explore abandoned buildings, but about 4 years ago, my girlfriend at the time and I visited an abandoned bottling factory in Milwaukee. It was a pretty well-known spot, so nothing seemed unusual about another couple who were also there exploring. We wandered through the various rooms, crossing paths with the other couple a few times, but they didn't seem like the talkative type and clearly wanted to be left alone. That was fine by us, so we just kept doing our thing. Eventually, we found a ladder leading to the roof. It was around dusk, so we thought it'd be nice to go up and watch the sunset. We walked around a bit on the roof, had a nice chat while watching the sky change colors, and then made our way back down. As we climbed down, we noticed the other couple leaving and started heading out ourselves. Everything seemed normal until we passed the clock tower part of the building. Suddenly, we saw huge flames billowing out of the empty second-floor windows, about the same height as where we had just been on the roof. We immediately called 911 to report the fire and let them know that there had been only one other couple there with us. After that, we got in our car and left. To this day, I'll never know if this was some kind of attempted arson homicide or if the couple thought we had already left and were just interested in the arson itself. Either way, it was terrifying to think about. Danvers State Mental Hospital. While exploring the grounds, I stumbled across an overgrown graveyard filled with tiny headstones, each marked with nothing but patient numbers, no names, no dates. The overwhelming inhumanity of all those nameless graves hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm not easily frightened, and up until that moment, exploring an abandoned mental institution in the middle of the night had been an exciting adventure. But that discovery wasn't frightening, it was deeply saddening and nauseating. My curiosity disappeared. I felt ashamed for intruding on a space that had borne witness to levels of human cruelty and suffering far beyond anything I could imagine. I left that night and never went back. I was exploring an old abandoned TB hospital that was later used as a hospital for mentally ill youth with some friends. It was located on a hill, surrounded by woods, and removed from the main roads. We had to slip under a fence to access the property. Most of the exploration went pretty smoothly. We found some eerie remnants of its past, like empty rooms with lone rocking horses, an old stage/theater, and those weird metal beds that might have been used for embalming or washing patients. On the third or fourth floor, we came across a room labeled morgue in spray paint. One of my buddies and I decided to check it out. When we walked in, it looked more like a power control room, with large fuses mounted across several big control boards. We walked in for a closer look with our flashlights when, suddenly, the big steel door slammed shut behind us. The door no longer had a knob or handle on our side, so there was no way to open it. We started pounding on the door, somewhat anxiously, trying to get our other friends' attention. While we were doing that, we started hearing movement in the room and the sound of fuses popping out of their sockets and clattering to the floor. Thankfully, our friends heard the noise and managed to get the door open from the other side. That was pretty much our cue to wrap things up, since the situation could have gone south quickly if there hadn't been anyone else there to help. Looking back, I attribute the door, noises, and fuses to natural causes. Maybe warped hinges or vibrations from our banging on the door caused the fuses to fall. Still, it was pretty creepy in the moment.